I'm going to receive my just inheritance from you. Madison, this is the only way we can secure our future. Mike asked to talk in his own voice, very sternly. My pulse raced as I shook my head and held my 8-month pregnant belly. No, I am not able to accomplish it. This heritage was left behind by my family, I whispered. Before I could process what was happening, Mike's hands forcibly shoved me from behind. I lost my balance and fell forward, crashing into the floor as darkness overtook me, my stomach exploding with agony. My name is Madison, and I'm 29 years old. Previously to the present. I believed that my life was ordinary. That vision was shattered a few months ago when my father unexpectedly passed away, leaving behind a huge wealth estimated to be worth over $50 million. Through real estate and other business endeavors, he had quietly accumulated a fortune, which he now gave to M.E.T. first. I found it difficult to handle such a large duty. My husband Mike seemed supportive at first, but things swiftly went south. As soon as Mike realized the real significance of the bequest, his actions altered. What had initially appeared to be a love marriage became a battle motivated by greed. He began to pressurize me and persisted in getting me to transfer the funds into his name. His questions seemed like harmless curiosity at first, but as time passed, his obsession intensified. Mike argued that we must take the money in order to safeguard our future, which led to an increase in the frequency of our arguments. I had no idea how far he would go to acquire it until he shoved me. I never imagined that the man I married would put his own financial security ahead of his own family. It was clear over time that Mike's love for me had been overshadowed by his avarice for the riches I received from my father. When my father passed away, I couldn't be happy. Losing him was the worst thing I had ever gone through. I was in mourning. I learned about the over $50 million in enterprises, investments, and real estate he left behind. More than money, it was his legacy and life's work. I wasn't sure whether to think about it at first, but Mike was always fixated on it. There's so much we could do with that kind of money. Madison, we need to get moving soon before additional individuals show interest. He would say a terrifying need was shining in his eyes. I tried to brush his comments off, believing them to be the product of pure passion. But it was quickly clear that Mike did not think of the four of us as a family. He was consumed by what he could control. Every day, Dad would bring up the inheritance, stating I needed it moved into my name. He emphasized that it is safer that way. Each time, I said no. This heritage was left by my father. Mike, I'm not able to just hand it to you, I said, my voice trembling from the weight of yet another argument. With every rejection, the man I knew, the one who had protected me and our unborn child, was turning into a different person in front of my eyes. In his place stood a stranger. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, the tension released. Mike had been distant the whole evening, his eyes cold, his voice clipped. Madison abruptly stepped in front of me and said, I could feel the storm brewing. You have no idea what you're doing? If you don't give me that inheritance, you'll come to regret it. Startled, I responded. Mike, you do not own this money. I declined to take part. He sprang at me, and his face twisted in rage before I could say anything. I was knocked down hard by a powerful backhand from his hands. The whole energy of the fall was taken by my tummy, and I felt an instant, sharp agony. Mike was shouting, but I could no longer hear him as blackness enveloped me. When I opened my eyes, everything looked hazy. I could hardly move because my stomach felt so severely. I tried sitting up, but my body was too heavy and feeble. My mind raced over what had happened, and then all of a sudden I was back in control. Mike shoved me, sending my bulging stomach hurtling down. Anxiety gripped me. Frantically, I put my palm to my belly to feel movement. I experienced a sigh of relief. Eventually, I felt a tiny kick, and the baby was still there, fighting. Still, I suspected something was off. I needed help. Through my blurry vision, I could see Mike was pacing the room, muttering to himself. He looked more strange than the man I had loved before. There was no trace of concern for me or the baby in his expression. He didn't seem to be aware of the damage he had done to Mike. My tone sounded distorted, almost whispery. He looked at me, pausing, but his eyes were hard. "You'll thank me later," he replied coldly, as if the violence was justified and his avarice gave him the right to punish me. I realized Mike wouldn't assist. Since I was alone, I had to gather my strength. I successfully stood up and positioned myself on my stomach. "The hospital is where I'm going." Without waiting for his response, I spoke haltingly. The pain worsened with time as the ride seemed to continue on forever. Second, my baby took up all of my thoughts. Would they survive? Was this nightmare going to be the last thing that mattered to me? The staff escorted me directly to the maternity ward as soon as I arrived at the hospital. The baby and I were examined by doctors as I lay there, barely hanging on. I could hear their voices, some anxious, some calm, but none of the words stayed in my memory. I was too afraid of what they may say. Finally, a doctor approached me. He had a serious expression, yet there was also a sense of comfort in his eyes. I felt a sense of relief, but the fear lingered when he said, "You and the baby are stable, but we need to keep a close eye on you." For now, though, I was safe, even though I knew this had nothing to do with lying in that hospital bed. I had time to think about it all: the cruelty, the betrayal, the distantness. Mike believed that I had replaced the man I had known with an obnoxious and selfish mentality, having lost faith in the man I had known. Even though it hurt to confess it, I realized that I could not stay with him. For my own sake and the sake of my child, I needed to go back. I spent the next few days trying to get my thoughts away from the things that had captured my attention. I hadn't talked to Mike since the fall, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew other than that my father had turned into a monster because of his inheritance. I never could learn to forgive. When I was heading out of the hospital, I made a decision. That man's place was never going to see me again. I would make sure Mike never saw the money, and I would defend my child. He learned so much. The life I believed I had was shattered by one violent act. But I was still here. My baby was still here, and we were going to survive. Back at the house of my parents. I was comfortable and felt safe. It's been a while since my last emotion. My mother took excellent care of me and helped me adjust to my old bedroom, but my father was a steady, quiet presence in the background. In case I need anything at all. I simply couldn't bring myself to share anything that had happened with them. They knew about the bequest, of course, but I forgot to tell them about Mike's fall and his ensuing rage. I wasn't even ready to confront that part with them yet. Weeks went along as my due date drew nearer. I realized that Mike had not left me a single message or phone call. I was rather relieved. The other half wondered if he was planning or trying to use the money. His silence had the ominous quality of a storm's impending arrival. I wasn't so stupid to think he would just turn around. Mike was not the kind of man to give up easily, especially when millions of dollars were at stake. I needed to prepare myself for whatever came next. I did my best to convey the situation to the attorney I spoke with. Although the inheritance had legally passed directly from my father to me, I had to make sure Mike couldn't try to grab any of it because we were still married. Despite the lawyer's assurances that Mike didn't legally own the money, our conversation left me feeling uneasy. I had seen Mike's skills in action. His avarice had made me no longer recognize him, and I had no idea what he could do next. It was 1 week before my due date when my parents' doorbell rang. I had been resting, trying not to lose my cool in the final few days before the baby arrived, when the voice shocked me awake. I heard my mother talking to someone in a low, anxious voice as she opened the door. Then I heard Madison Mike's voice scream out in the hallway. My heart sank. I knew this day would arrive, but I was unprepared for him. I had no clue what he would say or how long he would work to get what he wanted. Take a deep breath in. I stood up and moved into the living room. He looked precisely like the man I knew as he stood in the doorway, but there was a new hardness in the look in his eyes. "Could we talk to each other?" he asked in a strangely composed voice. Against every instinct in my body telling me to stay away from him, I nodded. There was a tense silence as we sat down. Mike appeared to have begun with his hands clenched in front of him, I know that things became out of control. We still have time to make things right, even if I hurt you. We are able to collaborate as a family. I'll take care of you and the baby. All we need to do is work together. I was looking at him and feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. You bumped into me. Mike, you hurt me, and you didn't even apologize. All you cared about was the money. His face took on a harsh expression. Though I was mistaken, I was considering how money might ultimately determine how our lives turn out. It can't just be tossed out. It's not yours, Mike. It was never yours. I firmly said, we're done, and you can't control me or the baby anymore. For a moment, I thought he may argue or push back, but I believed he detected something in my voice. He stood up slowly, his expression shifting as his eyes grew icy. If that's how you want it, don't think that this is the end. Madison, fine. I'll take what is rightfully mine. He turned and departed, leaving me sitting there with my heart racing. I recognized that I was stronger than I had ever been, even though I knew this wasn't the end. For my baby, I would fight back. I would stand up for what I possess. In the period after Mike's visit, I could feel the tension building as his final words reverberated in my mind, and I knew he wouldn't let go easily. It was most important to remember that my child came first. Mike was threatening to distract me, but I had to focus on meeting the deadline. I kept my parents informed, even though I didn't tell them everything. My father comforted me with his quiet strength and said that I was not alone in this. He could see I was going through more than pregnancy-related challenges, and although he remained silent, he was obviously protective of me. Mom was by my side as usual, helping me prepare for the baby and making sure I was comfortable. Then it happened late one evening, a few days before my due date. The convulsions started. My lower back pain was bearable at first, just a dull ache, but with each wave, it got closer to what labor would actually be like. I called out for my mother, and my parents came to my rescue, helping me into the car so I could be taken to the hospital right away. As I struggled through each attack, the bright hospital lights, the calm but hurried directives from the nurses, and my own breathing all blended together. I was uncomfortable as hell, but I felt compelled to protect my child from Mike's reckless actions and his inheritance obsession. Everything else took a back seat as I focused on bringing my child into the world safely. Hours passed after what felt like an eternity. Finally, I heard the wail I had been listening for. I began to cry joyfully when the nurse placed the tiny bundle in my arms, because my child was finally here and alive. Anything else disappeared at that very moment. It was the beginning of a new life, simply for my child and me. However, even in that incredibly joyful moment, I was aware that there was yet hope. Mike was still out there, being consumed by his greed, but at least I had someone else to watch out for my kid and myself. I would do whatever it took to make sure we were safe. A few days later, after being released from the hospital, I headed back to my parents' place with my baby in tow. The house had a new feel to it, filled with the reassuring presence of relatives and the soothing sounds of my baby's breath. But a persistent anxiety lingered, as if we were all waiting for something to happen. Then it did, for real. One afternoon, I was rocking my infant to sleep. Recently, I received a call from my attorney. Madison. She spoke in a serious manner. I've been informed that Mike filed a claim to contest your inheritance. My heart sank. What do you mean by this? As your spouse, he is claiming a share of your estate should be his. He's trying to prove that the money should be part of the joint estate. I felt a cold panic course through me. Mike was not going to give up. He was taking what wasn't legally his by using the legal system. He was going to accomplish this, but I wasn't going to allow him to win. What steps should we take next? I asked in a shaking voice. Confidently, the lawyer said, we fight. It will be a fight, but together we'll prove to the judge that the inheritance is legitimately yours, he said. By the time I hung up, my baby was still dozing off in my arms. I knew that the storm was coming, and I also knew that Mike would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But ever since this whole experience began, my personality has evolved. After I called for my lawyer, the days that followed felt like a race against time, but this time I was stronger and I had something far more important to fight for than money. I was never able to fully embrace my baby because I was constantly afraid of what Mike was trying to do. His claim staked his future on an unclaimed inheritance. However, I was not going to back down and let him control my life or the upbringing of my child. My lawyer is putting in a lot of effort to prepare our case. For as long as I could, I concentrated on my child. I was never more at ease than when I cuddled with her or watched her go to sleep. Because of her, I was going to face whatever Mike had planned, no matter how terrible it became. 1 week followed by another. The legal process moved at a very glacial rate, but I tried to be patient. My lawyer informed me that there was not enough evidence to back up Mike's claim. After all, the inheritance had come to me directly after my father's death, and Mike had no legal claim to it. But Mike continued to use every possible law to challenge me and give me the idea that this wouldn't end. One afternoon, as my mother and I were discussing the next steps in the court case in the living room, the doorbell rang. I felt a wave of anxiety go over me. My mother went to answer it and noticed that the sounds in the hallway were muffled. Then Mike's comments stopped me cold, like a knife piercing through the air. "My motivation for being here is Madison," he pressed. "I need to talk to you." I stood up, legs shaking slightly, but I did not back down. When I went to stand with Mike at the front entrance, his dark eyes glowed with the same cold determination. "What brings you here?" "Mike, you know you shouldn't be here." With a knot of fear in my stomach, I spoke in a steady voice. He stared at me with a contemptuous sneer on his face and crossed his arms. "Madison, you're adding unnecessary complexity to the situation. I'm here to communicate, to put it simply, so you may see reason. If you could only hand over some of the inheritance, we could move over this. We could even divide up the child's upbringing." My blood boiled at what he said. How daring of him to stand in front of me as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't pushed me to the ground and endangered our child and myself. He was crazy if he thought I would ever trust him again, much less give him access to my family's fortune. "No, Mike, you recognize that this isn't about us and that you have no right to the inheritance." So I adamantly said, "I'm not signing anything. This is related to you and your greed." His grin faltered, revealing a fleeting flash of fury. "You think you're better than me. You seem to think that this is how you can ignore me. I'm doing everything I can to protect our child and myself. If you're done with me, you have to leave because I won't give in to your attempts to manipulate or dominate me going forward." My voice was shaking a little, but my will didn't waver. He just stood there for a moment, trying not to make an expression that betrayed his rage. I was left shivering as he pivoted on his heel and marched out the door, slamming it behind him. All that he said was that. As I walked back to the living room, my lawyer was talking to my mother on the phone about what had happened. "We need to get a restraining order," she said, her voice firm against the flurry of feelings churning within of me. That night, I woke up to discover my baby curled up next to me. I couldn't help but think of Mike's comments and his threats. He wasn't going to give up until he succeeded in his mission. But I'd already decided what I wanted. I was not going to fight for the money. I was going to fight for my child and our future. The next morning, we started the process of asking for a restraining order. I was told by my lawyer that it was the right choice. Given Mike's behavior and our growing disagreement, it offered an extra layer of protection that I desperately needed while our lawsuit was pending. Days turned into weeks, and then something unexpected happened. Mike began to make up stories about himself. Based on information my lawyer obtained, Mike was involved in some questionable business dealings, fraudulent transactions, and questionable conduct that were now coming to light. His reputation was crumbling, and it was clear that he was trying to safeguard the bequest since he was losing everything else. The magistrates sided with me. Mike had no rightful claim to the fortune, thus his attempts to seize it were unsuccessful. It ended the day the final decision was made. A wave of relaxation swept across my shoulders. It had been an arduous and protracted war, but I had won, above all. I had stood up for my home, my child, and my father's heritage. Standing in my parents' home, cradling my daughter in my arms, I realized that I was finally free from Mike's manipulation, dishonesty, and avarice. And then I looked at my baby's beaming face. I realized that the future belonged to us. The decision of the court to find in my favor. I felt a wave of relief sweep over me. However, the journey was far from over. My lawyer informed me that Mike was going to have serious legal consequences because of the evidence that had been gathered against him about his fraudulent actions at work. As Mike's reputation deteriorated, he was accused of fraud, which sparked an official investigation. Soon after, he was taken into custody and put under arrest. His once renowned career was ruined. The news of his incarceration was a depressing reminder of the man he had become, driven by avarice and passion throughout his sentencing hearing. I decided where to go. I wanted justice served not just for me, but for all the agony he had caused. The judge presented the evidence in an obvious manner. Mike was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his crimes in addition to making restitution to his victims. His rule over my life came to an end when the gavel struck, and I felt a sense of finality. Strolling out of the courthouse, I took a big breath and felt lighter than I had felt in months. I was finally free after a brave effort to free myself from the burdens of my past, with my baby nestled in my arms. I knew we had a bright future ahead of us.